They didn't see it coming, not from two quiet girls in matching blue hoodies who barely spoke above a whisper. But the truth is, war doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it starts in silence buried in sideways glances. In half-laughed jokes, in the venom that rides behind someone's smile. For Kayla and Kiara, twin sisters and top students at Whitmore High, that war began the day they stepped into the courtyard after transferring from their former school downtown. The campus was beautiful on the outside, ivy-covered walls, pristine lawns, trophies gleaming in glass cases, but there was rot underneath the surface, and it spoke through whispers. Who let them in? Probably some diversity program. They don't belong here. Kayla heard it first, standing by her locker as a boy in a red varsity jacket brushed past just a little too hard. Kiara felt it later that week when her science notes were found torn in the trash, smeared with ink. No one said it to their faces, at least not yet. The racism wore a polished smile, the kind that says, "I'm just joking," even when it stings like a slap. It came from the boys who thought the school belonged to them, the legacy athletes with family plaques on the donor wall, the ones who strutted through the halls like kings, confident no one would ever hold them accountable, and at the top of that food chain was Brent Mallory and his shadow, Luke Palmer, too smirking, entitled seniors who had never been told no a day in their lives. To them, Kayla and Kiara weren't students. They were targets, outsiders, threats that needed to be neutralized, not because the girls had done anything wrong, but because they didn't bow their heads. They walked with quiet strength, back straight, eyes steady, no fear. That's what scared them. So the games began, accidental shoulder checks in the hallway, whispered insults as they passed, dirty looks, books knocked out of hands, locker doors kicked shut before they could be opened, and when the girls ignored it all, the attacks escalated. An anonymous note was left on Kiara's desk, "People like you don't belong here." Another was taped to Kayla's locker, "Go back to where you came from." They didn't react, not in front of them, but at home, the silence between them told the story. Kayla stared at the ceiling longer than usual. Kiara closed her notebook a little harder than she meant to. Their mom, Marcia Lewis, a civil rights attorney with a spine of steel, noticed the shift. But when she asked, they both smiled and said, "It's nothing, Mom, just school." But school wasn't supposed to feel like a battlefield. And this battlefield was slowly taking shape, brick by brick, insult by insult, waiting for a spark. That spark came on a Thursday. It was overcast, a quiet sort of day. Kayla was sitting beneath a tree near the courtyard fountain, sketching. In her notebook, Kiara was in the library finishing her chemistry prep. Brent and Luke approached like they owned the place, laughing, loud, high-fiving other boys in matching red jackets. They spotted Kayla and veered straight toward her. She didn't move. Brent kicked at the edge of her sketchbook. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked, smirking. "Another one of your African protest drawings?" Luke laughed. Kayla looked up, calm, steady, and said nothing. That only fueled them. Brent grabbed the notebook and flipped it open, mocking the artwork inside. "Wow, so deep. Maybe you'll start a movement." Kayla stood up, slowly, took a step forward, held out her hand. "Give it back." Brent didn't move. Luke leaned in close and said under his breath, "You girls think you're tough, huh? Just wait. You'll learn what happens to people like you around here." Kiara was already on her way, having heard from someone that her sister was being cornered. She arrived just in time to see Brent crumple the drawing and toss it in the fountain. Something inside her snapped. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She stepped between the boys and Kayla, her arms crossed, her stance firm. Kayla moved beside her. The two stood shoulder to shoulder, twin statues of quiet resistance. Brent took a step forward. "You two better learn your place." Still, the twins didn't move. Luke's voice rose with a sharpness that cut through. "The courtyard. We'll kill you both." The air froze. A few students nearby stopped in their tracks, and still. The twins didn't flinch, because here's what the boys didn't know, what no one at Whitmore knew. Kayla and Kiara had spent the last 9 years training in Kyokushin karate. They didn't just hold black belts, they earned them through sweat, discipline, and tournaments that left their opponents broken. They had medals, trophies, scars, but more importantly, they had restraint, the kind that comes from real power. They didn't need to throw a punch to prove who they were, not yet, but something had shifted in the air. A storm was forming, and the boys in the red jackets had no idea they'd just provoked the wrong pair of sisters. It happened just after last bell on a Tuesday, the kind of afternoon when the shadows start to stretch and the school empties with a strange hush. Most students were already gone, spilling into cars or buses, laughing and snapping photos near the main gate, but Kayla and Kiara always took the back route home, a narrow alley behind the gym lined with dumpsters and a cracked fence that led straight into the neighborhood. It was faster, quieter, until today, as they turned the corner. They stopped in sync. 4 boys stood there, waiting, Brent, Luke, and 2 others from the varsity crew, Chad and Marcus, all wearing those same red and gold Letterman jackets, the school crest stitched like a badge of privilege across their chests. Their smirks were already loaded. They stepped forward, spreading out like a net. The exit behind them was blocked, the path ahead now a trap. Brent spoke first, voice dripping sarcasm. Well, look who wandered into the wrong alley. Luke laughed, cracking his knuckles. We heard you think you're better than us, Chad added, with your little silent stares. Think you're too good to talk to anyone? The twins didn't move, didn't flinch. Kayla's hands stayed in her hoodie pocket. Kiara's eyes scanned the layout wall to the right, open dumpster to the left, enough space to pivot. Their training kicked in not in panic, but in precision, because real fighters don't show fear. They analyze, they wait, and they don't waste motion. But the boys misread that silence. Brent stepped closer. You girls better watch yourselves, he said, smirking. Around here, we don't like attitude or arrogance. Luke's grin sharpened. And we definitely don't like you two acting like this school belongs to you. Kiara's jaw tightened slightly, just enough for Kayla to feel the shift in her twin, but it was Kayla who spoke first, her voice calm, steady, like still water before the break. Move. Brent raised his eyebrows mockingly. Or what? You gonna call your mommy? The other boys laughed, but it didn't last long, because Brent reached out, quick and aggressive, to shove Kayla's shoulder. He never made contact. Kayla moved with the precision of a coiled spring, her body pivoting, hand grabbing Brent's wrist mid-lunge, twisting sharply with a fluidity that didn't match her calm exterior. The crack was audible. Brent yelped, stumbling backward, clutching his hand. The laughter stopped. Chad rushed forward, fists raised, shouting, "You're dead now." But Kiara stepped in, blocked his punch with her forearm, and struck low into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him in a single move. Marcus hesitated, but that hesitation was a mistake. Kayla spun low, swept his legs, and sent him crashing into the dumpster with a clang that echoed off the alley walls. Only Luke remained frozen. His eyes darted between his friends on the ground and the 2 girls still standing, barely winded. Kiara stepped toward him, slow and controlled, stopping just inches away. You done? She asked. Luke nodded quickly, taking 2 steps back, hands raised. Kayla's breathing was even. Kiara didn't even bother to fix her hoodie. And then they turned just like that and walked away, leaving 4 boys groaning in their own shame behind a gym that had never seen anything like it. But it didn't end there. The school heard about it before morning. Whispers raced through group chats. Grainy photos began circulating. Someone had caught part of it from the science building's 2nd floor window. One frame showed Kale amid sweep. Another had Kiara's elbow mid-air, just before impact. Students who had barely noticed the twins before now stared as they passed, some in awe, some in fear, and some in anger, because boys like Brent weren't used to losing, especially not to girls they'd tried to humiliate, especially not black girls, especially not like this. That day in the lunchroom, Kayla and Kiara sat at their usual table, quiet, still, but the energy around them was different. Some students whispered respect, others whispered payback, but the twins didn't respond. They didn't boast, they didn't smile, because they knew what was coming. Not fists, something worse. Brent showed up to school with a brace on his wrist and a twisted smile on his face. He spun a story that made him look like the victim, that the girls ambushed them, that they were aggressive, that they needed to be handled. By the time the principal heard the story, it had already been twisted into fiction. The girls were called to the office. They were told the allegations were serious, that self-defense was no excuse for escalating violence, that they'd be placed under review. Meanwhile, Brent and his friends walked the halls laughing, knowing the system was built for boys like them. But the girls didn't back down, they didn't cower. They walked out of that office with the same calm they carried into that alley, because what Brent didn't understand, what the school didn't want to see, was that the moment they put their hands on the twins, they started a war they couldn't finish, and wars are not won by lies, they're won by truth, by control, by discipline. Kayla and Kiara didn't just defend themselves, they made a statement: we are not yours too. Break. What happened in that alley didn't just end with bruises, it ignited something that couldn't be undone. By morning, Whitmore High was a pressure cooker of whispers and half-true stories, echoing through lockers and lit up in every group chat. Some said the twins had hospitalized Brent. Others swore they saw Kiara break Chad's arm in one move. Videos blurry, 15-second clips circulated like wildfire. Kayla's sweep, Kiara's elbow, the stunned silence after impact. Teachers pretended not to notice the sudden shift in the school's social current, but it was undeniable. The hallway that used to hum with arrogant laughter from the varsity boys was now filled with hesitation. Brent, once the smug, untouchable golden boy, walked in with a brace on his wrist and a forced smirk, flanked by his friends like bodyguards, but no one clapped shoulders or tossed jokes his way anymore. He had been beaten, not just physically, but symbolically, by two girls who hadn't even raised their voices. But instead of learning a lesson, he doubled down. Power doesn't surrender quietly, it plots. That afternoon, Principal Hargrave summoned the twins to the office again. They walked the hallway together, like always, shoulder to shoulder, silent but unshaken. The receptionist wouldn't meet their eyes. Hargrave greeted them with a look caught somewhere between forced neutrality and quiet discomfort. He gestured toward two chairs and folded his hands. "There's been an incident report," he began, voice to smooth. "Several, actually. Multiple students claim that you physically assaulted for classmates yesterday." Kayla stared. Kiara blinked once. "They cornered us," Kiara said, voice calm. "We defended ourselves." Hargrave shifted. "Regardless, the optics are complicated. You two are new here. I'm trying to protect your records. Violence isn't the answer." Kayla leaned forward slightly. "But being assaulted is acceptable?" The principal's smile cracked. "Let's not escalate things further. You'll be placed under behavioral review for 2 weeks. You may still attend classes, but any further conflict will result in suspension." They knew what that meant, a warning with a leash. A way to muzzle them before the truth spread too far. The system wasn't built to protect them. It was built to contain them. But neither of the twins argued. They stood, nodded politely, and left without another word, because they weren't interested in arguing. They were interested in surviving, and more than that, they were preparing. But Brent wasn't done. That night, a group of his followers vandalized the fence near the alley where the fight took place, spray-painted slurs and threats in red. "Get out. You'll pay. You'll regret this." A security camera was mysteriously disabled. The school painted over it before morning, quietly, hoping no one noticed, but people noticed, and not just students. Kayla and Kiara's mother, Marcia, noticed too, when the girls came home and told her what happened in the principal's office. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I'll be at the school tomorrow, with the district representative." The calm in her voice was the kind that comes from knowing the law and knowing your daughters are telling the truth. The next morning, a quiet storm rolled through the halls. Marcia arrived in a sharp suit, documents in one hand, a copy of the student handbook in the other. She met with Hargrave behind closed doors. No one knew what exactly was said, but by the time she left, 2 things had changed. First, the school issued a vague statement of equity and safety, reminding students that retaliation and harassment would not be tolerated. Second, Kayla and Kiara were no longer under behavioral review, but even with that small win, the tension didn't die, it hardened. Brent and his crew didn't get punished. No suspensions, no write-ups, just a scolding behind closed doors and an understanding that things needed to stay quiet. That kind of injustice doesn't fade, it simmers. And the next time they saw Brent, it wasn't in the hallway. It was outside school, behind the corner store near the football field where he and two others tried to catch the sisters alone. But this time, there were witnesses, a student with a phone, another girl, who started recording the second she saw the confrontation brewing. Brent shoved Kiara first hard, reckless. She stumbled, caught herself, and that's when Kayla moved. It was fast, controlled, devastating, one strike to disarm, one sweep to drop. Kiara followed with a takedown that ended with Brent face first. In the gravel, yelling as his pride shattered beneath the weight of precision, the video hit social media within hours, over 100,000 views overnight. Comments poured in, "Those girls are legends. Why are they not teaching the school?" This is what self-defense looks like. The school tried to pull the clip down, but it was too late. The world had seen what Whitmore had tried. To Barry, that evening, Kayla and Kiara sat on the rooftop of their building, legs dangling over the edge, wind in their hair. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to exhale, not because it was over, but because they'd crossed a line. They weren't just students anymore. They were symbols, not of violence but of discipline, of self-worth, of what happens when you push too hard, too far, against the wrong pair of sisters. And when Kiara finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "They should have walked away," Kayla nodded. "Now they'll never forget, because that was the truth about this chapter. The fight was never about fists. It was about identity, boundaries, power, and the moment Brent threw that first punch, he lost everything." By the time the viral video hit 250,000 views, Whitmore High was no longer a school, it was a spotlight, and the administration scrambled beneath it like insects under a lifted stone. Parents were calling, alumni were questioning, reporters had started emailing the front office. But instead of accountability, the school's first instinct was survival. The next morning, Principal Hargrave called Kayla and Kiara back into his office, not with apology, not with protection, but with polished language meant to control the damage. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, with a tight smile and careful eyes that didn't quite meet theirs. "We believe this incident is being exaggerated online. These things have a way of snowballing. What matters now is preserving the community." He used words like healing, restorative dialogue, forgiveness, but never once did he say justice. The twins sat still, silent, letting the weight of his words float in the air. "We're asking for your cooperation," he continued. "It might be best for everyone involved if you consider a voluntary transfer, a fresh start." Kayla tilted her head. "You're asking us to leave." Hargrave blinked, still smiling. "I'm offering you peace." And that was the moment it became clear. The school didn't want peace. It wanted quiet. It wanted the story gone, the sisters out of sight, the varsity boys rehabilitated and reintegrated, complete with a glowing student newsletter feature titled, "From Conflict to Courage, Forgiveness and Brotherhood at Whitmore." It included a staged photo of Brent and Luke shaking hands at a team practice, surrounded by smiling faculty members. Not a single mention of the threats, not a single mention of the bruises or the slurs or the fists that came before the fight. Just a school-sponsored rewrite of history, one that painted the aggressors as misunderstood young men and the twins as an unfortunate, inconvenient footnote. But Kayla and Kiara didn't disappear, and neither did their mother, that same afternoon. Marcia Lewis stood outside the school gates, flanked by microphones and flashing cameras. She wore a gray power suit and a gaze sharper than steel. Behind her, Kayla and Kiara stood side by side, calm, proud, and unshaken. "My daughters were threatened, cornered, and assaulted," Marcia began, voice steady and cutting. "They responded with legal, measured self-defense, and now the institution meant to protect them is punishing them for surviving." She lifted a printed still from the viral video, a moment frozen in time where Kiara stood firm, arms raised, while Brent lunged. "If this were your child," she asked, staring straight into the camera, "what would you want the school to do?" Within an hour, the clip was trending. Hashtag justice for the twins. Hashtag black belt sisters. Hashtag Whitmore cover-up. Local news picked it up by sunset, national outlets by the weekend. The pressure grew louder, heavier. People across the country began weighing in: civil rights activists, teachers' unions, students from other schools. Protesters gathered outside Whitmore by Monday, holding signs that read, "Silence is compliance and discipline racism, not resistance." Meanwhile, Kayla and Kiara returned to class under a strange new spotlight. Some students stared in awe, others with quiet resentment, but no one dared touch them now. The boys, once untouchable, found themselves shrinking in the very hallways they once dominated. Brent refused to make eye contact. Luke avoided the gym entirely. Chad transferred schools without warning, and yet the school still refused to fully admit fault. A statement was released: sterile, corporate, cautious. We are investigating the incident and reaffirm our commitment to equity and safety, but that wasn't enough because the truth was now public. And truth, once exposed, doesn't crawl back into silence, but not everyone celebrated. Some teachers voiced their discomfort behind closed doors. Some parents called for the twins' expulsion, painting them as violent and divisive. Anonymous notes began appearing again, only this time left in Marcia's mailbox at home. "You're making it worse. You're tearing the school apart." But she didn't stop, and neither did the girls, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. About standing tall when the world demands you shrink, about refusing to be edited out of your own story. 1 week later, the school board held an emergency session. Marcia attended. So did the twins. So did the press. Witnesses gave testimony. Legal advocates spoke, and when it was over, the room fell quiet as the decision was read aloud. The school had violated its own code of conduct by attempting to coerce the twins into silence. The principal would be relocated. The varsity boys would face disciplinary review and be removed from extracurriculars pending further investigation. And as for Kayla and Kiara, they would remain unpunished, unsilenced, and unbroken. The following day, they walked into school as usual, hoodies up, bags on their backs, feet steady. But everything had changed. No more whispers, no more laughter at their expense, just silence, not the kind they feared. The kind they owned, the kind that follows people who have survived fire and come out stronger. Their lockers, once vandalized, now bore sticky notes that said respect and thank you. One even read, "You made us all braver." And though the story would eventually fade from headlines, one truth would remain etched into Whitmore High forever. The system tried to erase them, but they chose to rewrite the ending. They didn't need a parade. They didn't need applause. They just walked quietly, deliberately through the main gates of Whitmore High like nothing had changed, even though everything had. Kayla and Kiara moved through the courtyard with the same calm stride they'd always had, backpacks slung over one shoulder, hoodies pulled up, eyes forward. But this time, the air around them was different. It wasn't cold with judgment or thick with whispered hate. It was heavy with respect. Students who used to mock them now stepped aside. Eyes followed their every move, but not with scorn now. With because everyone remembered what had happened, and even the ones who pretended not to care had seen the footage, read the headlines, watched the silence turn into a storm that shook the school from its roots. The principal was gone, placed on leave after the board's decision. The boys who once ruled the cafeteria and gym walked with their heads lowered now, stripped of their scholarships, their reputations scarred beyond repair. A few had transferred, unable to bear the weight of public shame. But the twins? They returned, not as troublemakers, not as victims, but as something else entirely: figures carved from fire, whose quiet strength had become legend. They didn't speak about it. They didn't have to. Their presence said enough. The whispers had stopped because no one dared to reduce them to rumors anymore. The same hands that once scribbled hate on bathroom stalls now tapped quiet notes of support onto desks, sticky notes that read "thank you" or "respect." Some students, especially younger girls, started wearing blue hoodies in solidarity, walking with their shoulders a little straighter. Teachers glanced at the twins with a kind of uncertain admiration, like they knew they had misjudged them and now didn't know how to undo that mistake. In the library, one of their favorite spots, the librarian had quietly placed a book on the shelf facing out, "Fighting Silent Battles, Stories of Resistance and Resilience." A quiet nod, nothing more. But Kayla saw it, and she understood. Wordless recognition was enough. That week, Kayla and Kiara were invited to speak at a student council event, Voices That Matter. At first, they declined. But when a freshman girl approached them after class, teary-eyed, and said, "Because of you, I stopped hiding who I am," they agreed. On stage, they didn't perform, they didn't dramatize, they just told the truth. Kiara spoke first, voice steady. "We didn't fight because we wanted to be right. We fought because we had to be seen." Kayla followed, her gaze sweeping the auditorium. "And we're not asking for attention. We're asking for space, equal space, safe space." The applause was slow at first, then thunderous. Later that evening, sitting on their apartment rooftop like they always did when they needed to breathe, the sky stretched dark and wide above them. The chaos had passed, but the lesson remained. "You think it's really over?" Kiara asked, eyes on the stars. Kayla took a deep breath, then exhaled. "No, but we've already won, because this was never just about a fight behind the gym. It was about erasure, about a system that tried to make them small, invisible, forgettable, and they had refused. That was the real victory. Not in the punches, not in the video going viral, but in the simple act of walking back through those doors without bowing their heads, in reclaiming the space that tried to push them out, in showing every student who'd ever felt othered, silenced, afraid that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, hood up, eyes forward, unbothered and unbroken. Weeks turned into months, and the buzz faded. New dramas emerged. New faces stirred the school's attention. But even as Whitmore moved on, the memory of what happened never left. Stories became whispers. Whispers became myth. And in those myths, Kayla and Kiara became something more than students. They became proof. Proof that silence has a limit, that dignity has a weight, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground and refuse to be less than whole. And so, each time the sisters walked that courtyard, their footsteps echoed with something bigger than themselves. They didn't strut, they didn't intimidate, they just moved like people who had already been through the fire and knew they'd never be burned the same way again. And for every student who watched them, especially the quiet ones, the ones who sat alone at lunch, the ones who were told to stay small, the message was clear. Not all battles are fought with fists, but when they are, make sure you know who you're fighting.